So I'm going to be telling you about SAS cache, scatter and split securely today. That's our new cache design that tries to defeat cache contention and occupancy attacks. So you know me already now. The problem, as we and others see it right now, is that cache side channels are really easy to use, they're very powerful, they're robust, and they're simple. And so with that, they enable a large number of attacks, such as direct attacks, like recovering a key across VM boundaries just from the cache, or they can also be a basis for more complicated attacks like Spectre, Meltdown, or Foreshadow, or something like that. And so specifically for the last level cache, other people have already proposed many designs. They all have various trade-offs. And so, of course, we thought we can do the same thing. We can add another design with trade-offs. But we hope that ours are maybe an improvement on prior work. So before I begin, I'll go all the way back to the basis of cache attacks. And that is, we have a cache in the CPU. We can store memory. So when we do something like access a variable here, we get a cache miss if it's not there. We try in the DRAM, we fetch it, put it into the cache. And so now the next time we try to use this variable, we get a cache hit. And now we're already all professionals as far as measuring time is concerned, because Stefan told us about it. So we can measure that the first one from the DRAM is really slow, and the second one from the cache is much faster. So that's our base that we can use for further cache attacks. And one of the most generic variants here is prime and probe. And so for that, you need to know that the cache is not just split into cache lines of 64-byte chunks each, but also cache sets. And so each address is associated with one of these cache sets. Usually there are around 1024 or 2048 cache sets, at least in Intel CPUs. And so what an attacker can do is find a collection of attacker addresses that fill or perfectly map to one of these sets. And then in the prime step, an attacker can fill an entire set. And so when the attacker now waits for a victim to come along, a victim might also load data into the same line. And now necessarily, it has to evict one of the lines of the attacker that is already there. And so the next time the attacker comes and looks at the timings, it can do what we talked about before, measure, and see at some point there's a slow access. And so now the attacker can infer the victim probably did something with an address in code or data that goes into this set. And that's enough to break some encryption or leak some data in some way. All right. And so several people a few years ago already saw this problem, and in particular for LLCs suggested secure randomized cache designs. And so the thing that all of them came up with is that there's one particular reason that this is easy to do, and that's that to know which set an address goes to, you just look at some bits of the address. And so this just slices out, for example, 11 bits. And part of that is even the virtual address, so the attacker can just directly read it, and the rest is easily recovered. And so the notion for randomized cache designs here is that we just make it a lot more complicated. And so this was the work that we built on, scatter cache, but other designs at around the same time used a very similar construction. So here we introduce an index derivation function. And so we just put in a key, a hardware key, and a software domain ID. And now, critically from the address, we take the entire address without the lower bits. So that's not just this 11 bits index, but also the rest. And so now, for each key or key pair and address, we generate an entirely unique set of lines. So each cache set is now shuffled, and basically no one will know, neither attacker or victim, where an address is going to go. So that's the basis for this here. And at the time, in scatter cache, we already recognized there are still specialized prime and probe variants that you can use to attack this. And we calculated something like 2 to the 25th profiled victim accesses that you need to do, just so you can find which addresses of yours collide with the victim addresses that you're interested in. And this is really easy for a standard attack, where it's less than maybe 100 X's or something. And because it's now probabilistic, if you want to be sure that you evicted an attack, now you need something like 275 addresses just to evict one address in the victim with some certainty. And then a certain secure cache-hating fiend came along. He's sitting right there, Purnal, and found a better attack method. So that's prime, prune, and probe. And so he said we can reduce this by 3 orders of magnitude. So at 2 to the 10th around there, victim accesses, this is not quite as secure as we initially thought. And then also, as the title suggests, there's the occupancy channel, which is a very simple cache side channel. We just fill up the entire cache, and then after the victim has run, you measure how much of your data is still in the cache. So you don't get this locality information anymore, where the victim accessed something, but you know if there was a difference in how much the victim accessed, and that can be enough to leak data. And with SAS cache, our hope was that we can improve on both of these. Yeah. So a tried and true method, of course, is to add more complexity. So that's exactly what we did here. So we split this index derivation function into an index generation layer that performs basically the same thing as scatter cache, and then a second index spacing layer that takes these values and then produces the final offsets. And so what you maybe notice here is that now these offsets, some of them are colored in green and some are white. And so for this design, for a particular key and SDID combination, no address can ever reach these white spots here. And so each way here might be 1024 deep, where you can select from, but some of these will be never reachable for a domain, for a key pair. Yeah. And so this gives us our security, basically. Yeah, let's look at that in a bit more detail. So as is, I think, best practice, we created our own crypto. And the idea here is that we generate an intermediate. It should be a bit faster than using, I don't know, AES. It should be really quick. And for this intermediate value, we need one, let's say, 11-bit value, if we need to select from 2048 options, for each cache set. So maybe if we have 16 cache ways, and we need 11 bits each, then we execute in parallel 3 of these ciphers and then slice out these indices. So this is basically scatter cache and similar designs. And then we plug them into another layer of even more lightweight ciphers. But here is where the magic happens. If we plug in 11 bits only into the input of 64 bits, and then you only take out 11 bits, then you get some kind of compression effect. Because those 11 bits, this input space, is now spread over 64 bits. And so, in effect, when you put 11 bits in of the possible 2048 outputs, each key can actually only reach about 1290. And so this is what our security builds on. Yeah. And this gives us, a notion of coverage. So with this default configuration of 11 bits in, 11 bits out, for example, we would get something like 63% of the cache that are reachable for a security domain. And in this example, we have 10 lines here, and 6 are reachable. So if we add a second domain, what we now see is that they, of course, also have 6 lines, but in red, there is some overlap now. But crucially, some of these lines do not overlap. And so when we extend this out to, say, 16 banks for 16 cache ways, then we now create a set. Maybe we select a set like this, or we select a set like this. And then the question is, if I'm an attacker in domain B, what are the odds that all of these little cache ways here are red, so are shared totally with the second domain A if I want to attack them? And for 63% coverage, it's fairly low. For our recommended configuration of 39%, it's very low. And so to put this in more practical terms, if you had 32 gigabytes of RAM, only 161 times 64 bytes of those would be fully reachable by an attacker. So we think this is it's still probabilistic, but it's a pretty good security guarantee here. So the security is now built on first the scatter cache. It's still very hard to profile this. But then the observation that prime and probe does a lot of repeated observations. And necessarily, the prime step evicts the victim. And so when now our index spacing layer comes along, it provides us a certain profiling resistance because it adds a hiding property. So addresses, once they're evicted a certain number of times, hide. And that means, because we have random replacement, whenever a victim address is evicted, when it's loaded again, there's a certain chance that it lands in one of these ways that is not shared with the attacker. And so as you can see here, for 39% coverage, after only about 4 target evictions, there's basically a 0% chance that the address is still accessible by the attacker. So this basically gives us a security guarantee. We're comparing here 4 evictions until a victim address hides versus the 2 to the 15 accesses that we might need to profile that address. And profiling is just a step before attacking even. Yeah. So in conclusion, we get strong security against profiling, which is the first step before attacking. Occupancy attacks also don't work if you can't see the victim. We get better scaling than partitioning. We didn't touch on that, but that's because this scales better. Because if we have, for example, 8 partitions, then if they're fair, we're already down to 1/8 of the cache size. But we might already get the same security with our 39% coverage. And so there's a chance to have more cache available. And lastly, sadly, this is of course not free. So we see something like a 2% drop in hit rate in spec. And in Cham5, in micro benchmarks, we see an average of around 12% performance loss here. All right, and with that, I'm at the end and open for questions.
Thank you for the talk, Lukas. We have time for questions. Guru.
Great work and great presentation, Lukas. If I understood it right, the coverage metric that you have where lower coverage metric give you better security, does that mean that a program can now use lesser part of the cache? Like, is there capacity loss for?
Yes, the coverage is directly how much of the cache you can still use. Yeah.
And quick follow-up, is that tunable? Like, some programs might want small regions of the cache, others might really want more regions?
Not really. So you have to set the security parameter on the global level. So in the cloud, that would be the hypervisor. And you say this system needs to meet this security threshold. Because the problem is, if I just say this one doesn't need as much, but this one wants more, then the one with more is a better attacker on the smaller one. So you can't have this control here. You need to set one target. Maybe that's 39%. Yeah. But this problem also goes a bit away, because if we have, say, 8 threads trying using the cache, then you automatically, if it's a fair distribution, only get around 1/8 of the cache.
Thanks.
So.
Hey there, great talk. Could you give some ballpark numbers on the area and energy overhead, and how intrusive should be the changes to the cache architecture itself?
Short answer is no. So, sorry. With this work, I think we're fairly far away from an actual implementation in an Intel CPU. So I think we have some numbers in the paper if you're interested, but I wouldn't claim that they are super realistic. So we did, yeah.
Fair enough.
Sorry.
Okay, I have one final question. How does this compose with the coherence directories?
Coherence directories. Well, if the last level cache is the point of coherence, I think these are fairly orthogonal. I think we probably have that in the paper. I'm not entirely sure. Sorry.
Okay, then let's take that off.
You caught me off guard.
Okay, so let's thank Lukas again.